To their critics, they are a dangerous Sinn Féin-controlled group whose hallmarks are physical threats and intimidation. To their supporters, they are the heroic defenders of their communities against the scourge of the heroin dealer. Maggie O'Kane reports on the rise of the concerned parents.
Early in 1982, the people of Dublin's working class areas banded together to fight back against heroin. The concerned parents movement had begun. Heroin dealers who had once traded brazenly were now confronted with crowds of people marching outside their homes, their names brandished on placards.
Drugs were rampant at that time. You know, they were rampant at that time, and it was very hard for the mothers that was raising children to try and keep an eye on their children, especially there's a lot of mothers here had large families. It was hard for them, you know, to keep an eye on them, and I mean, kids were picking up needles off the ground. It was horrible.
We're not vigilantes, we're not going out using violence or battering people up, we're just turning people away. We're a concerned parents group, and we're just turning people away from the flats. That if they're coming in for drugs, there's none to be got here. Since last Thursday, Bridgefoot Street is being drug free. We've detoxed the flats. Let's go!
One day I was walking through Dolphin's Barn. Down by the old canal I saw some children in a car. In the back, shooting smack, I had a bird's eye view. I dialed 999, they said there's nothing we can do. On both sides of the river, clearly to be seen. Down along O'Connell Street, up to Stephen's Green. Heroin sold openly, there was no need to hide. The drug squad were outnumbered, they maintained their hands were tied.
My name is James Smith, born in Kerry, and then at the age of 18 I joined the Jesuits, and it is the usual course of training. And after some years teaching, I ended up as curate in the new Gardiner Street parish. And after some time there, the residents invited me to live in the flats, and I applied to the corporation and got a flat for me. In our area at home, when I was a child, I was born in 1928, they were still telling stories about what happened when the barracks and all those were burned down. And officially, there was no law and order for quite a long period. And the only law and order was when black and tan lorries appeared from nowhere. And so people had to they actually set up their own structures for dealing with crime during that empty period. I remember as a child being fascinated by that. I was particularly struck by the way the rows within families were dealt with. They kept on calling them up to know have they settled it. If they hadn't, they sent them off for another week. And after about 4 weeks, the family settled it themselves. That was the best way to deal with a law case of that kind. And I felt the hardest was something similar, because you had a kind of a closed community there with a lot of very important links and understanding of one another.
Mom, baby, you have a cup of tea? Coffee.
Mushrooms, peppers, onions, chicken, curry. I got married and I had 3 children within 5 years. And I started working in a pub. It was known as the Jet File down at the Keys. I didn't realise what was really going on until I saw them standing there in the toilets, injected themselves, and blood splattered on the walls and everything else. It was a horrible change. It was a horrible, horrible change.
The situation was so bad up there in the flats. I mean, it was infested with heroin pushers. And Father Smith stood at one of the arches and he told them all, he said, if anybody tries to sell heroin, he said, I will not hesitate. I will have them arrested. I'll have them reported. And I mean, he stood there day after day. He was a great inspiration and great strength, you know, great help to us all.
The flats was very, very run down. You'd be kicking syringes out of the way instead of footballs, you know, and people would be sitting on the stairwells, drinking, kids, young kids, and using heavy drugs. And the place was just in shambles. You couldn't go out, people wouldn't go outside their doors. You could see the fear in people's faces.
We have seen these addicts come in here in the middle of this playground, and the young children here, and have been injecting themselves in front of our young children.
I feel people don't take the problem seriously until it hits them. I remember about 6 months ago talking to some of the families here, some of the parents, and they didn't realise that a problem was going to start.
But governments know, departments know, there have been reports, commissions.
But nothing happens until the local people get involved. That's my personal belief.
We had fighting in the streets, taxis coming in with people buying heroin. And in a strange way, some message got around that it would be dangerous to interfere in any way with the business that was going on, that they were not going to cause any trouble themselves, the people involved. But if anybody tried to interfere or stop them, the word shooting was mentioned.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is
Jim
with you.
Smith, who lived in Hardwick Street Flats, made an approach to the Workers' Party, and I suppose indirectly in a way to the official IRA, looking for help because he wanted to organise a meeting of tenants in Hardwick Street Flats to protest about drug dealing and dealers who are actually living in the flats. My understanding of it was that the official IRA decided not to get involved, and the reason was that the Workers' Party as such was becoming quite strong in Dublin as a left-wing organisation, and they were afraid that if things got rough and there was violence involved, it would drag up all the past about the official IRA and its existence and all the rest of it and what it did. So they said no.
There were three of us, actually, two fathers of families there and myself, we were talking. And we called a meeting and not many people turned up. A number of the women turned up very concerned about what was going on. But that was about all. So one lady whispered to me, get Christy Burke to join the committee because he's from the flats here and he runs a kind of community welfare office just around the corner. So I approached Christy then and he agreed to come on our committee.
He called to an office that I had in Blessington Street. It was a Sinn Féin office. He told me he was there on behalf of the committee and he asked me if I would assist in trying to do something about the drug problem and the heroin epidemic that was taking place in Hardwick Street.
Jim knew that if he could get Christy on board and Christy would come to the meetings and support their stand, the people would feel safe enough to come out, because there was genuine fear. As I say, we're not just talking about dealers, we're talking about criminals who were organising the dealing and controlling it. So there was a genuine fear that if they came out and protested, that people would be kneecapped or worse. So Christy coming on board for that first meeting in Hardwick Street Flats was probably crucial to the movement getting off the ground.
I did remind Father Smith that I had been convicted for IRA membership and that I was now a Sinn Féin activist.
Christy was certainly a great help to us. He was very efficient. He was very active in the neighbourhood, helping people in many different ways with their human and family problems. And also, there were people associated him with other groups. So I think the fact that we had all that support was very important for us in those early days.
I did then approach the IRA structures.
The second major IRA attack in the very heart of Belfast.
And tell them that the communities didn't have any protection from the state, and that if heat came on them, did they have the backing of the IRA? And the blunt reply was yes.
But I think it was like a game of chess. We had moves and they had moves, and they didn't know what we were doing and we didn't know what they were doing. So if they were guessing, I was quite happy about that.
I was born and raised in St. Teresa's Gardens, and I got married and moved out to Crumlin. My family sold flowers in Chatham Street, Grafton Street, and I sold flowers at Dean's Grange Cemetery. I left school when I was 13, finished 6th class primary, and then trying to find employment. You had to know someone that knew somebody, because as soon as you mentioned the name Teresa's Gardens, you just, oh, sorry, no jobs here. No jobs here.
It was a great community. Everyone was very close, and like if your mother wasn't home, you got your dinner in someone else's house. There was never a child just left and not minded. You know, the children was all involved in everything, you know, but since the drugs came, sure, that all ended.
We all became aware that there was dealing going on and people were addicted, and that came about through all the women on the stairways, where people were using in front of the children. It took a while to cop onto it.
We were down here and we were doing a cookery class actually, and we said we'd go for a jog after. And we went up jogging up to the field, and there was 2 lads with their pants down, shooting up when we got to the field. So we decided we'd had enough. And we'd seen all this going on, but I think it was just because we were in the field and we felt very exposed ourselves that we realised what our children were being exposed to every day. So we decided that we'd call a meeting. And then we started asking other mothers to get involved and come to the meeting.
Loads of people came, didn't they? Yeah. Women, like mothers. Young mothers like ourselves.
Because we had to use the balconies and the stairs, and children were going up and down the stairs, and the sick was unbelievable. And there was another girl down there, she 2 little girls. She asked me, I mean, what am I going to do? They were all sleeping outside to our door.
Couldn't walk down your stairwell, there was syringes there, or there were spoons that you knew that you were born in. There might be 3 or 4 of them sitting on a footpath, just stoned out of a tree, drooling. I mean, it was just absolutely horrendous.
That's what would have brought the thing to my mind was my brother and sister. They would have been addicted. That was cruel to look at. I'd often wonder if my mother was still alive at the time, what she'd have done. Like, this happened so quick that people were gripped in addiction before anyone realised. People were gripped and wedded into it before anyone realised what was happening. My brother today will be dependent on 5 steps home. He'd be addicted nearly 30 years. But there's a lot of his mates and who grew up from him who would be be dead as a result of the drugs or the virus. I don't believe there was a family not touched by drugs of some description, whether it be nieces or nephews or brothers or sisters.
Everybody knew where this drug push was living. The smallest child in the street knew. We knew where he was, but the police was doing nothing about it. So we just felt we had to do it ourselves.
Word went around that the women were going to do something and call a meeting of some description. So they wanted assistance, and once they got up off their arse, then the men had to row in.
I think things started to get a little bit violent and women were being threatened and the men weren't going to sit back and let that happen. And actually we were ourselves getting scared. The pushers were big, tough people and we knew their background and that we wouldn't have been able to take them on. And we knew that the police wasn't really going to do anything about it.
Word had come through that there was a similar problem in Hardwick Street. And Christy Burke and Father Jim Smith's names were mentioned. They were putting patrols on in their area. So then we could go to the meeting and we could suggest this. But when we got to the meeting, everybody knew who was dealing the drugs in the flats at this stage. At that first meeting, there was a name mentioned of a person who was dealing drugs. And that was the first time ever, I believe. And he was asked, there was a delegation sent around to him to ask him to come to the meeting. And from there was great strength. There was 24-hour patrols set up immediately in the gardens.
We brought them to meetings first.
Yeah.
To give them the choice, right? Like you said, like you're pushing drugs. Now at the meeting now, what's telling you here now, this crowd is telling you, stop pushing drugs, I get out. So that, if they continue pushing the drugs, there was a big march. We all marched that person's door and stood aside and pushers out, like, you know.
It's just one of those spontaneous things. Someone said, what do we want? And everybody roared, pushers out. And that became a catch cry for the concerned parents movement then in the 80s. What do we want? Pushers out.
In the early 1980s, there were signs of instability. The economy was going downhill, unemployment was rising. In the aftermath of the hunger strikes, Sinn Féin had won a couple of seats on the border. Tony Gregory was elected to the Dáil in the north of the city.
Even with the very best.
So coming on top of all those problems, the emergence of the concerned parents were perceived very much by the establishment political parties as a threat to the status quo, and they would be reading that movement in those terms and in terms of how it might affect them.
The North Inner City had been neglected since the foundation of the state. In the 80s, people were still living in tenements, in the old Georgian houses, in large rooms. Many of the flats complexes in the area had no washing facilities whatever. At the same time, ironically, you had a whole range of very senior political figures representing an area that was literally a disgrace to them because of the living conditions that people had to exist in.
Although there was always crime in the area, there were certain untouchables. Like, nobody robbed in the flats. There was very little to rob anyway. Nobody robbed the elderly. Old people being attacked was unheard of in these areas. And all of a sudden, that was happening.
We were desperately trying to find a solution. And we heard about Teresa's Gardens and what was happening over there. We drove over there one night, and I think that changed a lot of people, because what we witnessed was almost evangelical. It was like one of these frontier church meetings, in which I had people like Whacker up the front, almost like one of those Western preachers, you know, full of energy, full of courage, full of wisdom. Telling people that you didn't have to put up with the dealers, you didn't have to put up with the situation, and naming who was dealing in their community.
I became a TD in 1982, and I would have raised the issue in the Dáil on numerous occasions. I always got the same reply. I got this reply so many times, I know it off by heart, even though it is 26 years ago. The level of heroin seizures remain low, according to the Garda authorities. Therefore, the problem is under control. And that was based on this view that if the Gardaí are not seizing substantial quantities of heroin, then as far as the establishment is concerned, there is no heroin problem. They never stop to think, well, maybe the Gardaí are not seizing heroin because the Gardaí are incompetent, or because very senior Gardaí saw this as just another social problem in areas like the North Inner City that had so many other social problems. And as long as it stayed in and was contained in the North Inner City, South Inner City, and places like that, nobody should really get too upset about it.
These were people who, in many ways, were naive politically, very frightened people, coming together for the first time with a very big threat hanging over them, this big bogeyman. And it was more than just the bogeyman of organised criminals, drug godfathers who would visit retribution on them if they stood up for themselves. But there was a huge solidarity amongst them, and a belief, for the first time in some of those communities, they could actually do something to help themselves and fight for themselves, because they realised the penny had dropped that no one else was going to do this for them.
Now, these evictions took place at about 12 o'clock or half 12 at night. People were knocked about their bed for a meeting in the youth centre, which is around here.
It's off of them. Whatever they were willing to dish out, we dish out twice as much. That's all.
Wacker grew up there on the stage, and he held that meeting, and he held it all together.
Yeah, he kept the meeting.
I mean, he was their chairperson. Yeah. We looked up to Wacker.
He was a good
I mean,
speaker.
everything went through Wacker, like, you know, and he was very, very strong in the community.
Now, this will bring us into the front block, where I was born and reared. In this particular block on the far side, the first eviction of the gardens took place. And all the furniture was tucked down on a human chain and left on the footpath for collection. Well, that was taking place up in this back block here, where the other two houses that the evictions took place in.
Absolutely fabulous flat. Bay windows, the works, it was gorgeous. Actually, at that time, you used to say if they bay windows, they're pushing trucks because no one else had any money to do stuff like that. But they went up and they knocked at the door a couple of times. They knocked harder, nobody. So they had already got wind of the word that we were on the way, and they'd gotten out with their children. But the flat was smashed up to pieces. So they never come back.
The following week, There was about 7 of us taken down to the local Garda station and questioned about it. The guard said it was a complaint made of it against us from one of the people that they were put out of home by us. Sometime after that, maybe weeks after that, word came back from the DPP that he wasn't pressing charges.
That's when the Bear to the Concerned Parents as a movement began, when people moved out of Teresa's Gardens, I'd say, and probably some of the flat complexes in the North City that simultaneously this was happening. When they began to move out, they might have just moved up the road, and people up the road, in the flats up the road would say, well, what are we going to do? Why should we take this? And very quickly, people began to say, well, if they've done it there, we can do it here. And it began to roll out in that way, and a movement was born.
The meetings were hard. They were hard. I mean, most times people would go out on their knees crying, like, especially parents, because they'd be at that meeting having no idea that their child is involved in anything. And then the name would just come out and the parent would fall to pieces. Because they're there as a concerned parent, protecting their children, not knowing that their own child might be involved in some way. Because the children were getting caught up very quick. You know, the children were destroyed.
And he is in bits, I know that for a positive fact. I'm after getting around, I'm after getting some of my family, and we can't get any further. I said I've only one life to lose. If it means I have to be shot to highlight it, let it happen.
The people's courts were, I think, to use that phrase, you know, it was a case of people going mental, of letting out a lot of anger, of directing it at the people they felt were responsible for their problems. And it overflowed into the families, especially the mothers of addicts and addict pushers, and telling them that if they didn't throw their children out, they'd be thrown out with them.
And I know she didn't know this was going on for a while, but believe me, if she had a child on heroin, or whatever it is they take, I wonder would she think it was so funny, because I definitely do not.
There's unfortunate families as well that their sons was doing the drugs, or their brother, and that we had to turn against the neighbours to tell him that, you know, he's not allowed to push drugs in the flats.
Yeah, see, that's
so the mother was taking the son's side. I can understand that. I do the same myself. But it was a big fallout. So the community spirit broke.
You had a lot of instances, quite heartbreaking, of mothers getting up and either denouncing their own children or defending them, and just you know, that sort of selfless but blind love of a child, which prevents you from accepting the reality that they were addicts or they were criminals. So it was very emotional. It was very frightening to watch in action. It was sort of revolutionary justice. It was like something out of the French Revolution or the Cultural Revolution going on before your eyes in the middle of Dublin.
But if you think for one moment you can punch anyone in Dolphin's house, any woman with 3 children, and get away with it, you might with other families, but you won't with mine. And that's all I have to say.
And by and large, particularly the people who said they wouldn't leave would be, I suppose, there'd be people who'd be more feared in the community. There'd be people with kind of serious criminal backgrounds, many of them with kind of violent backgrounds, many of them who wouldn't be afraid of what, you know, they think the neighbours were going to do. But I think very quickly, with the amount of local people who are coming to your door to say, we're not afraid of you and we're not going to tolerate this, that certainly in those early days, won out. And by and large, most of the people either stopped selling drugs or they moved on.
A couple of people would just go up and say to the parents that we think Johnny, for instance, is involved in drug pushing. You need to talk to him and you need to ask him to leave the flats if he's drug pushing. Otherwise, the whole family would be evicted. So it wasn't that the family was evicted straight away. They got a warning and they were asked to ask the child to leave. And sometimes those kids were too young to be asked to leave their home. So the parents would be hanging in, trying to defend them. Families that left quiet. They're thrown out. And that's where the violence comes in.
I joined RTE in late 1973. What kept me in RTE in current affairs was that there was severe social disadvantage in the South. I did programs on unemployment and tax evasion, and there was a sense that the political system was boosting, and particularly on the Fianna Fáil side, the moneyed classes and the developers and so on. So there was severe unemployment, severe deprivation, severe poverty. And in the north, this awful conflict, which was spilling over on occasions into the south. Now, into that came the drugs issue.
As city children fall victim to the heroin craze, local communities turn to vigilante methods to protect them.
Today Tonight and RTE would have been occupied a particularly important role, because in those days RTE was the only Irish broadcaster, and Today Tonight would have been a flagship current affairs programme. So once you had something on Today Tonight, it put it on the map as far as the rest of the country was concerned, and would very much affect, if you like, how Middle Ireland and how the establishment as well, to some extent, regarded a problem.
We got this invitation. RTE wanted to do a programme on it, and we had a meeting to discuss whether we'd take it or not. And I, of course, was very suspicious of RTE. I never liked them from the beginning. And I wasn't anxious to take it, the invitation, because I knew that they would try and twist my position, but the others wanted to. And they were probably wiser.
Lads are there behind you. That's a 24-hour guard on the flats.
It's different shifts that we have.
We all take it in shifts to get out.
We have a day shift, we have a night shift, and then we have the early morning shift as well that comes out.
We could see that it was a highly toxic, significant programme. There's no doubt that the programme's made a major impact because it was raw and very upfront, and a lot of the filming that we did was within the communities.
They were anxious of it was a kind of sensational thing, I think. And it was, they had the church and the provost together and this kind of thing.
Yeah. And who else?
How do you mean?
Well, who else? Who has done most of the work?
Well, we've only just started, but we've got a lot of help from Mr. Burke as a community worker in this area. He knows the people very well.
Instead of treating us as the victims, they treated us as the aggressors and the pushers as the victims. It was an extraordinary reversal of roles.
Well, would you agree that some heavy tactics were used to get the message across?
Oh, I don't think so.
Well, people locally tell us that there were.
Well, I haven't heard anybody saying that.
Any of the things, the positive things I said, they didn't include them in the programme. About the fact, the right of self-defence and these kind of things.
Does it bother you at all that a lot of the work was done by the local provision of Sinn Féin?
I don't agree with that.
But you yourself told me that it was.
It's done by a community worker, Mr. Burke.
Yeah.
So he's on the committee here.
Yes. But what I'm asking you is simply because some people might remark upon it.
I never asked who's Sinn Féin, who's Fine Gael, who's Fianna Fáil.
I remember that interview well with the priest, and I remember feeling that perhaps I was a bit too tough on him in this sense, that it may have appeared as though I was accusing him of being some way or other in cahoots with the IRA. That issue was confounded by the fact that because Christy Burke was Sinn Féin, we couldn't interview Christy Burke directly.
At their Dublin Central by-election news conference, Sinn Féin spoke in support of community action on drugs. Jerry Adams said they supported the armed struggle in the north. On drugs in Dublin, Sinn Féin was happy to promote the IRA. IRA speaks on drugs and crime.
Section 31 was a ministerial directive. It was the government telling RTE that there were certain people they couldn't interview. Sinn Féin was among them. There were loyalist groups. By and large, they were people on the IRA side, INLA, and similarly loyalist paramilitarism. And it meant that we couldn't interview them. I had to work within it. There were restrictions on what I could do and say. It led to certain weaknesses in what we produced, and maybe this programme illustrates it. There were compromises, but there were big public issues at stake.
Christy Burke, a Sinn Féin candidate and Secretary of the Residents' Association. Christy Burke and members of the association visited the pushers, and pushing within the flat complex stopped. There was no argument.
We would have facilitated Brendan O'Brien in Hardwick Street for a number of days. He would have got the cooperation of the local women and the local residents, and indeed Father Jim Smith. But on the night under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act, I was prevented from speaking. It was portrayed that this was an IRA front, that this was a ploy by Sinn Féin to go out into communities, lead the people down a cul-de-sac in order to get votes. It was far from the truth. We became more cautious. We didn't give as much information as the media would have thought they were going to get. We didn't trust too many of them.
The Concerned Parents were never a front for Sinn Féin or manipulated by Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin certainly had an influence and struck a chord with the Concerned Parents. But I think it suited a lot of people, particularly in the establishment, to portray the Concerned Parents as some sort of vehicle for Sinn Féin, because it was a way of explaining away this fact, the phenomenon that there were these working class communities which were in revolt against the establishment because the system had failed them. And it was much easier to explain that by saying they were manipulated by Sinn Féin than admitting that the system had failed them.
We couldn't interview Sinn Féin themselves because of the broadcasting ban, Section 31. And that undoubtedly left an unfair balance, an unfair bias even, in the final balance of that piece, which is unfortunate. But for myself, those were probably the most important programmes I feel I'd made in the 30 years or so that I worked with Current Affairs and RT.
I suppose there is a whole lost generation in St. Teresa's Gardens. Even now, most grandmothers are burying their grandchildren because their children are dead.
I try to get around the block one more time each day. And that's what my son said to me one time. I said, "How are you today?" I said, are you feeling any better today?" He said, "You know yourself, Ma," he said, "just trying to get around the block one more time." And I think he summed it up for me and a lot of people. Just trying to get around the block one more time.
By March last year, the Concerned Parents had become an organised and structured body. Their first march in Dunleary drew this reaction from the Evening Herald.
Provost rap into Dunleary. Fascists take over march. 2 van loads of fascists arrive in Dunleary. I happen to be driving one of those vans. And there was no fascist in my van. What was in my van were concerned parents against drug pushers.
The growth of the Concerned Parents movement had not gone unnoticed by the state. Everyone could feel that confrontation was inevitable. And it came in May 1985 when the Concerned Parents decided to move against Ma Baker. She was a close associate of Martin Cahill, better known as the General, who would have had a certain amount of muscle to back her up. So there was really a great deal of fear of Ma Baker, and obviously they had to take her out.
So this is the Ma Baker house here, farmer house. And I remember us meeting along here down the square, and there was barrels lighting, there was fuel, there was fires.
Local people had organised and names were being mentioned, and Ma Baker's name quite regularly got mentioned. And it was decided to put a picket on her house, and this was what would happen if someone either didn't come to the meeting or was refusing to accept the will of the local people that they were not wanted in that area because they were selling drugs.
She did something which was quite clever from her point of view, and I think may have been influenced by Martin Cahill's advice, because he was very close to her. And she went to the guards in Kevin Street, which was just across the road, and told them that her house was being unlawfully occupied by these vigilantes. So the guards were going over there, a very clear idea of what the law said. And probably the Gardaí at this point in time also saw this as an ideal opportunity to put the concerned parents in their place.
I had 6 children at the time, and I was very concerned because I actually lived next door to this lady. It was very hard for the mothers that was rearing children to try and keep an eye on their children, especially there's a lot of mothers here had large families. It was hard for them, you know, to keep an eye on them. And I mean, kids were picking up needles off the ground. It was horrible. She was given a week's warning, you know, it had to stop. So it didn't stop. So we decided to hold a visual outside our house. And we took turns during the night coming out and sitting outside to make sure that people weren't coming, you know, coming and going. So then it came to the stage then the following week that we decided she was getting out of the house. We needed to get her out of the house.
There had been several instances of intimidation during that week, including at one stage I remember a crossbow being put out of the window, and there was a strong feeling that this couldn't be tolerated anymore. And then the word went around that we were going to occupy the house.
There are the steps there, and we were able to run around the back of that house and over the back wall. We took siege of the house, if you like.
There was chanting and the usual, what do you want, push us out, and all of that. And there was some of the main people from the concerned parents coming to make speeches and rallying the crowd.
When the police came in, like, we weren't expecting it. It was just, it was just something, it just happened in a flash, and everyone was running all over the place. People were just, there was chaos. It was dreadful, like, people just didn't know where to run.
So we decided that we're going to barricade ourselves into a room.
We couldn't hold out against the strength for long.
We could hear them piling up the stairs, and then it was the battering ram was coming at the door, right? Which huge thudding sound of just battering down the door, which, to be honest with you, was terrifying.
I remember at that stage that there was a side window, and I hopped out the side window. I knew I was the one. I was the one they wanted. But I thought if I could get out the side window into the crowd, then I may be able to address the media. Because the focus I was putting on was the media. But anyway, that didn't work. They arrested everybody.
I remember seeing the door splinter. I was at the window and I said, fuck this, I'm going to jump. So I jumped, and there was a photograph the next day in the Irish press of just how close the cops' baton had come to me. As I landed, the cops were everywhere. And we were fucked into the back of a van, into the Mariah. For people who didn't get out the door, didn't get out the window, they were severely beaten. What was coming into that van then was people, as it turned out, with broken arms, with blood streaming from their heads, where there was no mercy shown for anyone who was in the room that they got their hands on. And we were all brought down to Kevin Street Police Station.
They battered people. They gave terrible injuries. And there was crowds of people outside Kevin Street protesting.
Eventually, I remember I was released that night, and when I came out, there was hundreds of people outside the police station. It was seen as a victory. It was seen certainly as a moral victory that, again, communities had the courage and the strength and the wherewithal to stand up to the dealer who had no concern about people's lives.
I think it was a couple of mornings after that, about 6 o'clock in the morning, a couple of police came to my door and said they had a warrant for my arrest. And I hadn't an idea what they were talking about. So it was just preventing this lady from going into her house and stuff. It was mostly men, but there was 3 women. I was one of the women. And we were charged. And I still didn't know what we were arrested for. It got to the stage even the people were collecting money from the houses around here in case we were convicted to pay for a solicitor to get us off.
We were charged with breaking and entering and criminal damage or something like that. But anyway, we were not criminals, basically. And we would not have taken this action if it wasn't for the neglect of the state and it wasn't for, you know, the support that we had in the community.
We were always sure and confident that no jury would convict us of anything, because when they heard the facts, the true facts, it would be very, very hard to convict someone who were standing up for their rights, for their community, for their children.
We were charged in different groups, and the first one, the jury found them innocent. The second one, the jury found them innocent. And halfway through the third, the case collapsed and the state withdrew the charges.
They didn't have a case because there was no jury had convicted anyone else. And I don't think there was anyone for a minute ever going to deny that we were in the house. But basically what we wanted our moment of court for on that occasion was to explain and get a chance to explain to the people of Dublin why we were in that house and what was going on in that house. And from it, we were just being branded as vigilante type people.
It was obvious that whatever the adverse criticism was of the concerned parents, there was a feeling out there amongst a lot of ordinary people that they didn't have much choice but to resort to the sort of tactics they were using against people like Mar Baker. So getting juries to convict them was not going to be easy. And that's what happened. Juries wouldn't convict them because they felt that at the end of the day, even if they went a bit beyond where they should have gone or broke the law in some way, at the end of the day, they were only trying to protect their communities and deserved the benefit of the doubt.
At that stage, I was the chairman of the concerned parents. And whether they see me as a name or a figurehead, somebody was going to be the fall guy for them.
Normally, there's a monthly meeting of the clergy from the different parishes in the inner city to discuss items of common interest. So I made a suggestion that we should pick on a Sunday. In every parish, we preached about the heroin business, threatened to name names if we all knew who the people were. But unfortunately, there was only one vote for that proposition, which was my own.
By 1987, the Gardaí had upped their game in relation to the concerned parents. There was a lot of surveillance going on. There was use of informers. There was a plan to deal with them and to deal with the type of tactics that they knew the concerned parents would use when they tried to export the revolution to other areas.
There was a lot of talk going on, but it's hard to know how much intimidation there was. My own flat was broken into at this particular period. We presumed it was a signal that they were prepared to be unpleasant.
I remember at the time a member of the committee, a neighbour of mine, he had a gun put to his head. He was threatened that he would be shot dead if he continued to oppose drug dealing in Hardwick Street.
The Southside Dunn family in the early 80s were largely responsible for the supply of heroin into contacts they had and pushers that they had in this area. And one of the brothers in that family, in fact the guy who was directly responsible for supply in the North Inner City, turned up at one of our meetings in Rutland Street School. This tall, very healthy looking, physically strong guy comes in, dressed in leather from head to foot, and is given the microphone.
And he started clamosing, saying, "What's the problem? Everybody knows me. I'm one of you. All that's been said about me is not true."
I think most people were mesmerised because there was no immediate negative reaction from the crowd, strange as it may seem. So I just took the microphone out of his hand so that he couldn't continue to speak, and told him that if he wanted to do something for the community here, he could do us all a favour and go down and throw himself in the Liffey. He thought that by turning up, he'd cow the people into, not using his name again and not targeting him. And he thought he'd get away with it, but he didn't get away with it, and the people in the audience showed that they weren't going to put up with that.
Well, the concerned parents grew up spontaneously in the different communities, so they reflected those communities. On the north side, because you had this fairly tight-knit group of people who spent most of their lives, adult lives, campaigning for better things and a better way of life and better prospects for their communities. So they came to it in a more, if you like, civic society mode. It was equally dangerous in many ways and equally confrontational at times, but it was a more coordinated approach. More willingness to work with the social agencies, the state agencies, even the Gardaí on the north side. On the south side, there was a feeling that it was them against the world, and they clung together very tenaciously and were much more into marching on dealers. If you like, and I use the term sparingly, there was a stronger vigilante element to what was going on the south side than on the north side. I don't think they had much choice in certain situations but to adopt the role of vigilantes.
The issue of confronting people directly, very quickly we realised that that wasn't manageable and it wasn't sustainable in the longer term. So we adopted a different strategy whereby we talked about the problems at the meetings, but we didn't mention names, and if somebody had a name who they knew or suspected was dealing, they submitted it. In some cases these accusations were spurious, but if there was a case to answer, we offered the person who was being named an opportunity to defend themselves with the committee in private.
There was an incident happening out in Ballyfermot, and our group were asked to go out and support a picket that was taking place, and we went out, and the crowd got more and more restless, and they wanted these people out that night. So the whacker said to me, "Nick, will you come into the house with me?" So the two of us went in. Now when we went in, there was a couple of Staffordshire dogs. There was a guy with a sword, one of these swords. And I need to tell you that it was a bit rattled. But we said to them, "You're going to have to go, or the crowd is going to attack you." Suddenly, a stone hit the window, this big plate window, and a stone bounced off it. And the guy who was the chief target said, "If you can't control people, why do you rouse them up?" And I said, that's you're the one who's caused this, not us. But if that window had shattered, we were sort of in a bad way. So when we came out of the house, Walker said, "Look, we want everybody to get back, that the people that we targeted from the house are going, that they're getting out tonight." And the crowd started abusing us. They started saying, "Well, what deal did you do? How much did they give you?" and all this. And I realised they weren't going to move. So I went over to our people, and sure enough, a van came out somebody could have been killed. But it was from that our group realised the limitations of that form of protest. That people were so angry, so alienated, that if you aroused them emotionally, things could get done. And in turn, people who'd been brutalised could easily themselves become brutal. And that's where we drew the line and said, we've got to come at this another angle.
I remember asking myself when I was living in Hardwick Street, if this happened when I was a child, what would have been the reaction locally? And I know that the men in the locality would not have allowed it to happen. And if it started, they would have told the people, if your own private life is your own business here, but you're not going to sell stuff to our children, and if they persisted in selling, that would have been stopped by any means that were necessary.
One day I was walking through Dolphin's barn. Down by the old canal I saw some children in a car. In the back, shooting smack, I had a bird's eye view. I dialed 999, they said there's nothing we can do. On both sides of the river, clearly to be seen, down along O'Connell Street, up to Stephen's Green. Heroin sold openly, there was no need to hide. The drug squad were outnumbered, they maintained their hands were tied.
What happened here in Ballymore was there was a lot of dealing, and believe it or not, there was a lot of dealing getting done out here. Next door to the cop shop. Right next door to the cop shop, under the noses. Openly, every day. So, we went out to a few public meetings and we gave our kind of advice to them and support. And we said we would support them in that they were doing.
The Ballymon adventure was the final act for the concerned parents. They'd more or less achieved what they could in their own communities. They were now trying to export the revolution to other areas, and they picked Ballymon because it had a bad drugs problem. But Ballymon was a complete antithesis of the inner city, even architecturally, where St. Teresa's Gardens, for example, was almost designed for street theatre. You could have mass meetings in the complex and everybody was involved. Once you went out to Ballymon, it was a wasteland. You could march 10,000 people out there and they'd be lost.
So just in the back there of the shopping centre, we used to have our meetings down there, and we done an eviction after a public meeting. There was a delegation went to knock on the door, and there was nobody in. I remember the door being kicked down. I was there in the crowd. You know, we would come and lend our support and go along as a delegation if needed to speak to someone as members of the CPAD Central Committee. But the eviction that took place would have been actually by locals. So people just went in and basically what happened was that the contents of the flat was just thrown out the window. Some locals would have said, here, the quickest way out of this. You know, and then you kind of, you lost the momentum.
And John Humphreys, he's a family man. Him and Sally give their children everything they can. faced with the scourge of heroin, did not accept defeat. Joined other concerned parents to get heroin off the street. Then they marched on dealers' houses, asking them to quit. Time and time again, we've had enough of this. Needles in the plain fields where children run about. If you keep on dealing heroin, you're going to be moved out. From St. Teresa's Gardens out to Ballymore. Concerned parents had the dealers on the run, until the brass in Harcourt Street got their knuckles rapped. Word came down the line, these parents must be stopped.
The following Saturday, I was sitting in my home, and I had my niece and my daughter in the house. And the Gardaí arrived with a warrant to arrest me and charged me with threatening a drug dealer with putting a gun to him. Now, I could sit here and swear on any Bible that that didn't happen. That definitely did not happen. And I was taken away and charged.
The Special Criminal Court is made up of 3 judges, one from the High Court, one from the Circuit Court, and one from the District Court. There are no juries. They hear all the evidence and they make a decision on whether someone is guilty or not. They have a very high conviction rate, and it was a very deliberate measure to deal with organised paramilitaries and prevent them subverting the jury system.
3 drug dealers were brought in to point me out. Their evidence was taken, and I received 12 months. Now, the Special Criminal Court was a political court. Why wasn't I brought before a jury of my peers?
The idea of bringing concerned parents into the Special Criminal Court, as far as we were concerned, was part of the campaign to try to label us all as provos, IRA, front, and all this kind of stuff. Because when people think of the Special Criminal Court, who else was brought there?
For a case like an eviction to go before a Special Criminal Court, you know, an illegal eviction would be unheard of. I mean, the Special Criminal Courts were set up to deal with serious paramilitary organisations involved in things like kidnapping and murder and armed robbery and levying war against the state. So to use it for something which was almost a civil offence rather than a criminal one, or primarily a civil offence, is incredible. And it does suggest that there were people in the government who were very worried about the Concerned Parents movement, because I don't think even the most right-wing Garda superintendent would normally contemplate such a drastic way of proceeding with a case, and in fact wouldn't be allowed to, I imagine, without a decision being taken at the very highest level in the Gardaí, and even then probably only with approval from the government.
Well, the first thing that struck me about the trial is I felt people going in to observe it were being harassed. I've certainly felt harassed going into the trial. But it was the special court and that kind of thing did happen. And then in the course of the trial, I suppose, it was very, very interesting to watch. You know, it is very interesting to see sick addicts and dealers being used by the prosecution against concerned parents. That really stood out for me.
It's like something you see out the movies, the court itself. But packed out with guards and special branch. But it was also, the galleries were fairly full of supporters, and there were supporters outside as well.
They just destroyed us. Rock was gone then, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And they took him. So we just gave up. We just look after our own children.
Then the houses come available and we got a house. I was glad to get out of the flats.
And it just went to pot then. Dublin just went.
It's a shame, really.
Nobody wants to know, the police, nobody. They let it happen, didn't they?
And they were rounded up and charged with crimes against the state. They were brought down to the special courts to hear their fate. There was no jury, there was no bail. Concerned parents thrown into jail. I was sitting in the gallery with families, friends and wives. We strained to hear who told the truth and who was telling lies. Dealers and junkies on the prosecution side, swearing on the Bible before our very eyes. John Humphreys took the dealers on, he fought them tooth and nail. And 100 well-armed soldiers took him down to Portlaoise jail. Tried to protect his children, found guilty of a crime. One man gets a pension, while another man gets time. From St. Teresa's Gardens to Ballymont, concerned parents had the dealers on the run, until the brass in Harcourt Street got their knuckles rapped. Word came down the line, these parents must be stopped. Word came down from Leinster House, these parents must be stopped. That's it.
I mean, in some families, there was 3 or 4 young people died, you know, and towards the end of that period, people wanted to grieve in public. And I think that this is the real epiphany for this community, like insight, was that people start saying, yeah, my son, my daughter was out of control towards the end of their life. But they weren't scumbags, you know, that they were children. And it's sad, you know. Yeah. Too many kids.
For the first 5 years that we were really in operation, the flats were class. Like there was a waiting list to get into them. Everybody wanted to come and live in them because it was a new setup. A total new regime, and the flats was cleaned.
There's no drugs now. Flats are great. We don't even think of drugs anymore.
There'd be no way they'd come near the flats with drugs now.
It definitely reduced the amounts of drugs that was being pushed in St. Teresa's Gardens, and I know that we pushed them out somewhere else, but we reduced them in our area, and I think we had a lot less kids involved in drugs. And I think I would do it all again.
A number of reasons why I think it worked in Hardwick Street. That we certainly tackled it very early. We were able to get rid of the people from outside the flats. In that sense, it was easy enough for us to clear up things. But as some of the other areas had been suffering for a few years from and heroin was deeply embedded there, so it was much more difficult. And that's why you had so much violence in the other flats. We had actually no real violence in Hardwick Street.
65.
No more. You're that's near.
85.
No, 80.
87.
Just 80.
80?
Yeah.
80?
Nearly next month that'll be.
Yesterday. She's still quiet because she's shy. And she's shy. No. She is you in front of people, right?
I didn't ever think I was going to end up coordinating the drug team here in Dunor Avenue. And looking back all those years ago, I mean, that was It would be inconceivable even as to what that might be. Never mind achieving something like that. And I suppose in some way, because of those early days, I would like to think that I bring something additional to this job because of my experiences with CPAD and because of my involvement with this community.
I suppose the most important legacy of all is the folk memory that communities can come together and can fight powerful vested interests and can succeed, at least for a time.
I lost my son to addiction, heroin addiction. That made me angry. He left a letter that asked me to help anyone that was on drugs. And that's where my journey started. And that's how I ended up in Crinan, to help anyone that I could that was involved in drugs. It was called the Young Users Project Force, but we felt that was stigmatising them already, labelling them, so it was called Crinan then. My job spec is broad. I do cook a meal for them at lunchtime, create a nice atmosphere, and there's a great banter here in the kitchen. I just loved them. I know people see them as junkies and scumbags, and if they just sat and listened to some of their stories, my God, you'd have a whole different outlook on it. You really would. But Crinan is a great project. There should be an awful lot more of them around.